Well, welcome to another season of the Princeton Symphony Orchestra. We have a really fun concert today. My name is Gene DeLisa. I'll be writing the program notes this season, and I want to act pretty much as a tour guide for you guys. If you come down to visit me in Philadelphia, you'll probably want to get a cheesesteak at Pat's or Gino's, but I also want to steer you towards South Philly and Tony Luke's roast pork Italian sandwich. So that is pretty much what I'd like to do with the program notes. If you don't really look at the program notes or you don't come to the lectures, you're still going to have a really good time listening to the music. I don't know if you noticed, but the local radio stations and TV stations have been playing a whole lot of political ads. And one thing's for sure, those other guys are real jerks. So, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today? When we think of Richard Strauss and Johannes Brahms, they're great composers. They're master composers. It's hard to say anything about their technique that is a negative thing. But 100 years ago, there were these two political camps, and it was actually as nasty as what we're getting on TV now. There was a thread through the late 19th century started by Berlioz with the Symphonie Fantastique, continued by Liszt. You're probably familiar with Les Préludes by Liszt and a whole bunch of symphonic poems that he came up with. It was the idea of program music, or what they called the music of the future, which always reminds me of Ralph Cramden and the chef of the future. It's kind of a funny phrase. So there's the Liszt-Wagner camp, and especially when Wagner came aboard with all his minions, it became fairly nasty. Brahms, on the other hand, when he wrote his music, there really wasn't any program. There wasn't any story that was going on behind the scenes. They call that absolute music. I'm not sure it's a very good phrase because I don't know what relative music is. The things I'd like to point out in the pieces, I'd like to play a couple things for you. In the program notes, I know that you all don't read music, so the really important ones, I'd like to play little snippets of these things. I brought an MP3 player, but it just sounded awful, so luckily I had my laptop in the trunk, and that's why I'm sitting in front of the computer here, just to play these things. Okay, let's start with Don Juan, since it seems to be the first thing in our notes here. When you think of Don Juan, it's a very old story. It's about this guy who has lots of adventures with lots of ladies. Lots and lots of ladies. Mozart told us in the catalog aria that at least in Spain there was 1,003. Now, with Strauss, there actually is the Don Juan story that he is trying to paint in his music. And I'd like to point out a couple of things that are actually going on with it. Now, what he's trying to do is, the Don Juan story that he's using is from a famous Austrian poet, Lenau, who concentrated more on the psychological aspects of Don Juan and his mental deterioration. So, let's start with this first one. Okay, that is actually that very first example that you see in the notes there. So, if I'm a tour guide, I guess this is our beta curve. So, in that very first thing right there, you see that he's like jumping into action. It's very active music. And what did Michael Kennedy say? It's tumescent, erotic music. music. My goodness. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it is really very active, and it contains, in those few measures right there, most of the raw material of the rest of the piece. Okay. Now, the very first macho theme that we hear is this. Now, that's that second one that we see there. So, yes, that is bold and dashing. It picks up that dotted rhythm from the very opening, that da-da-da-da thing that we'll hear over and over again. Now, I really can't talk of the love thing, especially since there was 1003 in Spain at least. So the first one has to be a really contrasting thing. So it's long and drawn out and very lyrical. So that is the third one that we have there. Actually, when most authors talk about the love theme, which is one of the takeaways that you'll probably remember, it is this one. It's the second to the last one on the page. That is the composer of Rosenthal Lear. Even at the young age of 25, there he is being very lyrical. But there's something that you may miss just listening to that wonderful melody. What I'm imagining is he's with one of his conquests, and she's saying, "Tell me how beautiful I am, Don Juan." And he's pretty much looking at his watch saying, yeah, beautiful. You know, what's the score of the Eagles game? Now, how is Strauss doing that? If you listen to the cellos and the basses as the oboe is playing its lyrical theme, you hear this sort of restless, yeah thing. So let me play that just a little bit more. Okay, now what is really striking and what I'm very happy the graphic designer put on the same page is the next heroic theme, which appears in all the anthologies. If you actually look at the first couple notes, that looks pretty much the same as that love theme. You see it's even the same pitches and the same initial rhythm that is going on there. But when we hear it, it's completely different. Yes, bold and dashing. But you see, it begins pretty much like the love theme with a completely different setting. Now the climax of the whole thing, I didn't come up with a musical example for the end of it, but at the very end, I reproduced a poem that is at the beginning of the score. Strauss actually requested that these excerpts from Linnau's poem actually be printed with the score and in the program notes. So who am I to argue? There they are. Now, the very last one, the very last paragraph, is pretty much the climax and the end of the work. It was a beautiful storm that urged me on. It has spent its rage and silence now remains. A trance is upon every wish, every hope. So, what happens is at the end, there's a duel between Don Juan and another character that I'll talk about called Don Pedro. And it starts out with very swashbuckling music like Errol Flynn. Well, you guys are too young to remember him. Johnny Depp, this big sword fight thing. And then finally Don Juan says, I've had enough of this. It was a beautiful storm that urged me on. I've had enough. So finally he throws down his sword. There's this grand pause in the music, and he accepts the final stab from Don Pedro. So let me play that. So it's a sword fight. There's a grand pause, and I'll point out where he gets stabbed. So it's like the beginning. Just as a side note, that B-dominant seventh chord that we heard in the triplets right at the climax, and then the silence was followed by this strange progression to an A minor. Now, to our ears, that's fairly familiar, especially since the Twilight Zone, the very first series, used that as incidental music all the time to portray something really spooky. All you need is the harpsichord thing on top of it. But that was actually pretty unique back then. Okay, I need to move on. Keep forgetting I'm not in a classroom. We need to fit this in. There's actually a concert going on. So let me go on to Brahms and let's talk about the Dochnani at the end. This is Brahms' fourth. He lived quite a time after the fourth, but it is his final symphony. I'm trying to point out a few things here that are unifying threads throughout the symphony. There is no story, no interesting thing about Don Juan and his conquests and sword fights. Instead, what we're looking at is a fairly classical structure of a fairly traditional classical symphony. It's in 4 movements, not in 1 or 3 or even 5 as in Berlioz. The first movement is kind of an auto form. The last movement has some polyphony in it. Actually, it has a passacalia. It's a very famous, more ink has been spilt on the final movement of the fourth than anything else that Brahms wrote. The second movement is slow, and the third movement is sort of like a scherzo. The way he unifies things is there's a fairly complex succession of keys, but also thematically. Those are things that we can pick up on. So in that first movement, I have the opening there. And you see I put it in a grand staff to show you the bass also. Notice that the bass is sort of the same pitches as what you see up in the violins. It's sort of like a cannon, like in row your boat. First the first guys come in, and then the second guys come in. So let me play that. When you flatten that entire thing out, what a theorist would call is octave displacement, which is actually taking the same pitch and making it go 8 notes lower. See, in the second example, which really isn't in the music, I flattened it out to show you that actually is a series of descending thirds. And in the example I just played, if you look on the next page, you see it's followed by a series of ascending thirds. Now, just a simple thing like that would say, well, so what? But the way that Brahms interleaves this within every single movement is really sort of an astonishing thing that he uses for maximum cohesion of the entire thing. It was the way he spun out the entire symphony from that little bitty thing, that descending and ascending third, that caused so much admiration from someone that you really want to associate with Brahms. Arnold Schoenberg was a great defender of Brahms. Okay, there we go. Just a couple. So let me speed up just a little bit. If we look at the second movement, the second movement is slow, and it's actually in an ancient church mode, something called the Phrygian mode, which starts with a half step. Now, these days we learn all about ancient music in our music history classes, but Brahms, from a very early age, was interested in what we call musicology. He owned old manuscripts. He studied the Renaissance composers, and this is just one example. So that slow thing. Phrygian gloom and the E major. And if we look at that theme, you see it rarely does outline an ascending third and a descending third, a falling third. And if you also outline that a little bit more, you notice it's almost like a C major chord. See, there's like C, E, G there. And that is actually how the next movement opens. It's in a bright, sunny C major. Okay, that is the beginning there. And some Brahms scholars say, well, why is that last note, forte, forzando, like really, and it stands out. I mean, there's that big leap, from a fairly high note to this low note. What does that mean? Well, some people say that that's actually a preview of the final movement, the chaconne thing that I'll talk about in just a second. As a matter of fact, there's some conductors that take that to an extreme. Let me play that same thing. That was the Philadelphia Orchestra, of course. And let me play how Klemperer took that same thing. There was a grand pause because in his interpretation he actually bought into the theory that really was foreshadowing the chaconne theme. So that's some of the decisions that conductors have to make. It's not written in the score any sort of pause between that. It is written, played loudly and forcefully, but that was Klemperer's take. Okay, now the last movement. Let me just play the very first part of the last movement. The last movement is based on a theme from Bach. It was from Cantata number 150. The final movement was actually a chaconne. A chaconne and a passacaglia are fairly similar forms. It's a repeated pattern over and over again, and scholars argue about which one is a chaconne and which one is a passacaglia. Well, since Brahms called it a chaconne, okay, let's call it a chaconne. So let's play just that chaconne theme where it says allegro energetico e passionato. It was in the melody that the very top part was the chaconne theme. Now what we hear in the rest of the movement is that exactly in different voices and a different register, but fairly unaltered. It's repeated 30 times. You probably wouldn't hear that the first 5 or 6 times I heard this symphony, 100 years ago, I didn't catch that. But it really is there. And it was actually foreshadowed in the third movement. So on the previous page, the very last example on that previous page, in the climax of the third movement, he sort of foreshadows it. Where we just left off, that's the chaconne theme. Of course, it's sort of jagged. He does the octave displacement thing again. But he's saying, hey, this is a pretty important thing, and we're going to hear a lot of it in the fourth movement. Okay. We got just a couple minutes to go. So, that T for 2 that I played, does anyone recognize who the orchestrator was? Anyone ever hear that before? Well, that was Shostakovich. On a bet, he said, I could orchestrate this in 30 minutes. It was a tune he just heard, and he sat down and came up with this wonderful orchestration of T42. Now, of course, his reputation really doesn't rest on that Tahiti trot, which he called it, that T42 thing. But instead, there's all this other weighty things, some of which we're going to hear later on this season, that forms his reputation. Now, our last composer, Eero Dolkkanani, you may have heard that name mostly from his grandson, who was the music director of the Cleveland Orchestra. He is fairly well known right now just for the piece we're about to hear. But I've listed a couple other works that you may want to get to know. He wrote lots of music, but in his time, he was mostly known as a great pianist. So in the tradition of Liszt and Rachmaninoff, he also wrote music, and he wrote actually he was a very skilled orchestrator and a very skilled composer. He ended up in Florida. He ended up teaching at Florida State after the war. He taught piano in Berlin for many years. If you've heard this piece before, don't tell anyone what this nursery theme is. On purpose, I really didn't say what nursery theme it was. It's something that we all know. Now, what we're going to hear at the beginning is, we're going to hear, here it is. Is an introduction that really reeks of late romantic bombast. The language is Wagner and Mahler and, dare I say it, Strauss. What follows is a very simple introduction of the nursery theme. And the first time I heard it, I just laughed out loud. That's why I don't want you to tell anyone what's going on there. But in this opening, if you listen very closely in the horns, you'll see it actually being outlined. So let me play just a little bit of it. Computers, you know. It's a virtuoso piece that a virtuoso pianist such as himself could only come up with. What we hear, though, is pretty much what we heard with Viennese dance orchestras. The conductors of Viennese dance orchestras in the late 1900s would show how literate they are by making these things called potpourris of those other Strauss guys to show you how things work. If you listen to a jazz sax player, they're almost always, you're going to hear Charlie Parker or John Coltrane as part of their things. So that's pretty much what is going to go on with the rest of these things. You'll hear little snippets of a whole bunch of different works. Okay, so I'm getting this. So enjoy the concert. If you have any questions, I'll be hanging around.